Welcome everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to the series of lectures on ethical implication of AI. My name is Roberto Zicari and I'm very pleased today to introduce you to our guest speaker, Professor Christiane Wendehorst. She is Professor of Law and she's here as a co-chair of the German Data Ethics Commission. This is a commission that was tasked by the federal government back in September 2018 to give ethical guidelines on topics such as using of algorithm, artificial intelligence data. They did their work for almost a year time and they delivered their opinion on October 23rd, 2019 at the closing ceremony at the Federal Ministry of Justice and Consumer Protection. I'm extremely grateful that Christiane has accepted our invitation and her presentation fits extremely well our series of lecture. And Professor Wendehorst, the floor is for you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Roberto, for the kind introduction and also for inviting me to this series of talks. And good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to present some of the findings of the opinion of the German Data Ethics Commission. As Roberto already explained, the Data Ethics Commission was established back in 2018 with the mission to develop within 1 year an ethical and regulatory framework for data, algorithmic decision-making, and AI. And in fact, the federal government drafted up a list of questions. I don't know whether you've seen that list. It's online, it's on all the websites. And when we saw that list, which was a quite daunting list, we thought this is going to be a mission impossible because it was a list of some 50 questions or so, many of them very, very detailed, many of them very specific also. And it was really quite a task to do that within 1 year. I'm really grateful to Christiane Wopen, who was the co-chair. Most of you will know Christiane Wopen. She's currently also the chair of the EGE, so the European Group on Ethics in Science and Technologies at the European level. She was chair of the German National Ethics Commission. And so she took basically the ethics part, and I'm very grateful to her and to all the members of the Data Ethics Commission, in fact. Because without these members and their great, so you see them on this slide, and it was just really great working together with them. Despite the fact that, you know, they had been nominated by different parties, despite the fact that they came from different backgrounds, in particular, that they were a multidisciplinary body. So our members came from all sorts of fields, you know, from theology, philosophy, economy, many of them, of course, from the technical fields, many of them also from different branches of the law, that they were representatives of the industry, the consumers, the data protection authorities. Despite all these different backgrounds, you could say that each of them basically left their clients and constituencies at the door when we sat down and had our discussions on the best way forward. So that was really wonderful working together with them. And I would like to stress that throughout this year, our discussions were very focused, very intensive, of course, but always very friendly and focused on jointly reaching a position which we all could live with and which we thought we can safely submit to the German federal government. So at the end of the day, Christiane and I were very proud to report that we came up with 75 recommendations for action regarding data and algorithmic systems and ethical guidelines, and that these recommendations and guidelines were passed unanimously, which is quite extraordinary for such a committee where you have, people representing industry interests, consumer interests, data protection interests. So that's quite extraordinary, and we're very happy that we managed to do it. All this came at a price, and I have to apologize upfront to any audience to which I'm presenting this report. The report is rather lengthy, so the report is over 230 pages long, almost 240 pages long. And I always keep saying, if politicians had been prepared to give us 6 more months, we would probably have come up with half the size. But it takes time to be brief. And so when you don't have time, when you have only 1 year for this giant task, that's what you come up with a 240 pages document. Needless to say, there is an executive summary, but still, even the executive summary is quite lengthy. So this is something I have to apologize for and to explain to any audience to which I am presenting this report. But having said that, I would like to delve into the topic itself. First of all, why Data Ethics Commission? What is data ethics anyway? I mean, there are different notions of data ethics around. So a very narrow notion would be that data ethics is about handling personal data. That would be extremely narrow. Others would say it's the ethics of handling data in general, including non-personal data. And that is the notion of data ethics, the concept of data ethics that has been used in some documents of the European Commission. So I remember some workshops where I was invited to speak about data ethics, and it was explicitly only about handling data. Whereas the notion of data ethics that was underlying our work was a much broader one. So it was not just about handling data, it was also about handling data-driven technologies, including algorithmic systems and in particular AI. And possibly even going one step further and looking at the wider framework, such as the platform economy or the future of work. That was a little bit outside our mandate. So I would say it's the third line from above that is what we have been dealing with. So it's the ethics of handling data and data-driven technology, and any kind of regulatory or whatever recommendations that would follow from these ethical guidelines. Our opinion is divided into 7 parts, A to G. A starting with the introduction, which sets out, our guiding ideas, the guiding motives, which we thought were the basis of our work and what we would like to achieve with all our sometimes rather detailed recommendations. And these guiding motives are 8 motives. It's ensuring the human-centered and value-oriented design of technology. It's fostering digital skills and critical reflection in the digital world. It's enhancing protection for individual freedom, for self-determination and integrity, fostering responsible data utilization, which is compatible with the public interest, introducing risk-adapted regulation and effective oversight of algorithmic systems, safeguarding and promoting democracy and social cohesion, aligning digital strategies with sustainability goals, and strengthening the digital sovereignty of both Germany and Europe. So those 8 motives was what was basically the common understanding of everyone in the group, and this was the basis on which we then built our more detailed work, which I'm going to present in a moment. Given that our work was to a large extent considered to be based on ethical considerations, it will not come as a surprise that basically the first real chapter after the introduction was devoted to general ethical open bracket and legal close bracket principles. So it were those ethical principles that were very important in our work. And if these ethical principles, the general ethical principles, which you see in our opinion sound familiar to you, this may have several reasons. One reason is that they're precisely the general ethical principles which the EGE, the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies, listed in their statement or their opinion on artificial intelligence and robotics that had been published previously. And so, of course, that it's no coincidence because Christiane is also chair of the EGE and took the lead in drafting that opinion. So it will not come as a surprise that precisely the same general ethical principles were also very important for our work. It's also to be noted that the way these general ethical principles are phrased, are framed, there's nothing digital about them, actually. So human dignity, autonomy, privacy, security, democracy, justice, and solidarity, and sustainability, they're general principles we would have thought are extremely important also before anything digital came up, before we were discussing data and ADM and artificial intelligence. So, and this is not a coincidence, because it was very important for us to point out that really not much has changed as far as our basic values are concerned, as far as, you know, we ask the question, what is important for us? What is important for our society? What do we want to protect? What do we want to maintain? What do you want to support? So it doesn't come as a surprise that this hasn't really changed. It just needs to be put into perspective. We need to ask what is required in terms of data, algorithmic decision making, AI, if we want to uphold these values, if we want to have a society that is built on these general ethical principles. So the consequences and the details may change, but the ethical principles as such may not change so much. So it doesn't really come as a surprise that all this sounds very, very familiar to everybody. We also said a couple of words in that chapter about the relationship between ethics and law. For us, ethics and law do not coincide by no means, but there are, of course, strong links between the two. So needless to say, when drafting legal rules, we should try to come up with a result that we would consider to achieve an outcome that is ethical, and we would expect law to good law to comply with basic ethical standards, and to encourage ethical behavior, and to discourage and in fact prevent unethical behavior. However, the two are not the same. So the requirements of ethics may go beyond what is prescribed by law, and there may be some legal or lots of legal rules that are not precisely required by ethical principles, but that are of a more pragmatic nature. However, what was very important to us, and this is maybe something that is the hallmark of our work, and also something for which we were on the one hand applauded and on the other hand heavily criticized, is that for us it's part of, you know, ethical governance that you make some really important standards binding. So binding, that you enshrine them in the law, that you create a situation where people may enforce their rights, where they have rights which they may enforce if necessary, with the help of courts and state authorities. So this was a very important point for us, because we often see that situation where, you know, or that tendency, let's put it like that, that tendency to have ethical guidelines in lieu of hard and fast and binding legal rules which you might enforce. We all know this debate about ethics washing, and it may be the hallmark, as I said, of our opinion, not to engage in that kind of ethics washing, and to really stress that some really important ethical principles need to be enshrined in the law and need to be translated into hard and fast and enforceable rules. So that brings me to the next part, and this is one on which I will be extremely brief, because I'm the wrong person to talk about technological foundations. We were very happy to have a number of IT experts in our group. They all came from different backgrounds. That was also something we lawyers and philosophers and so on had to learn. We used to think everybody engaged in IT, you know, has the same or a similar background, and we learned in the data ethics committee that this is not the case. That also people having an IT background, you know, they have different approaches. So it's a huge difference whether you're dealing with data, or whether you're dealing with software architecture, or whether you're developing AI. So we had all these different perspectives in our commission, and we were extremely grateful for that. And I'm not going to, you know, try and explain what they so elaborately set out in our technical chapter. Just to say maybe that it was very important to them and to the whole committee to kind of demystify, if I may say so, even if we didn't use the terminology, to demystify the technology and do away with popular misconceptions that might be inspired a little bit more by science fiction than by science. And this holds true in particular for AI. You know, there are these conceptions of AI that it's something you know, it's like, you know, a wizard uses a wand and then the AI does something, and it's almost like a human does something. And our IT colleagues were very keen on pointing out that this is absolutely not the case with the AI we have right now, and with the AI which we're going to see in the middle range. So to demystify the technology was a very important point. It was also very important to point out that not everything we all may perceive or consider as data is really data, really deserves to be called data, because for example, the context or the semantics is missing, or and we also learned that data quality is not absolute, it's relative, it's dependent on the concrete purpose. So we really learned a lot from our colleagues with an IT background. And we also agreed, after discussing with them, that it's not useful to quarrel about the proper definition of artificial intelligence. You could go on for weeks just discussing what is the proper definition for artificial intelligence, and at the end of the day, it may not really matter so much. So what we decided is to not use the term at all. Because we thought, on the one hand, it's very blurry, and it's a buzzword that may be useful in the political debate, but it's not very useful when you look at problems on the ground. And the ethical and legal implications that matter to us, they seem to be more associated with algorithmic systems in general, rather than on, is it really AI or is it something different? So we decided, after discussing the matter with our IT experts, that we're not going to talk about AI, we're just going to talk about algorithmic systems and leave it at that. And then maybe where it fits, refer to some features like self-learning capacities and so on, but only where we believe this is helpful. So that already leads me to the next part, which is equally not a very lengthy part. It's part D on multi-level governance of digital ecosystems. And it's really a very important part, because it has been, some journalists who commented on our opinion, read our opinion as basically saying, it's all about law and all about regulation. And that is not at all the case. This is not at all how we wanted our opinion to be understood. And maybe it didn't come as clearly as we thought it is in our opinion, but we wanted to stress, in particular, by making this a separate part of our opinion, that certainly the legal level or law as a governance tool is by far not everything. Quite on the contrary, we need to address digital ecosystems at a variety of levels. And first and foremost, maybe that's even one of the most important parts, we need to address education and societal upskilling. We need to make sure people learn how to find their way and to enforce their rights in a digital ecosystem. So that's a very important part of governance. Education, upskilling, engaging in a critical debate in society, getting civil society involved. It's also about technology. It's how to build technology so that it serves ethical goals, sometimes called ethics by design, or aligning technology to ethical values. That's a very important part of any governance debate when it comes to digital ecosystems. It's of course about corporate governance, so it's not just about the legislator, it's about what happens in the companies. What kind of governance mechanisms are there in place to make sure data ethics has the right place in the corporate philosophy, to make sure there is a robust data ethics policy. You know, the Danish Data Ethics Commission, they proposed things like a data ethics oath to be taken by management in the future, and having data ethics seals, which would take us to a good mix of regulation, and self-regulation, codes of conduct, and so on. It's also about fostering research and development by various means, including by funding research, including by having a R&D friendly tax system. So it's really many governance levels, and law and regulation is just one out of many different tools we need to use if we want to address the challenges posed by the new digital age. And within that, multi-governance, multi-level governance framework, we saw that it may, for structuring our thinking and for the sake of making practical recommendations, it may be useful to differentiate between two different perspectives. There is no clear-cut delineation between them. They're overlapping, but it may be useful to differentiate between the data perspective and the algorithms perspective. The data perspective, that is something that is, for example, addressed by the GDPR. So that's about where do the data come from? What does processing of those data mean for those people to whom the data relate, or who have in some way or other contributed to the generation of the data? So that is being dealt with by the GDPR for personal data, and we may not have an adequate legal framework yet when it comes to non-personal data. It's about who has which rights and obligations with regard to data, and that's mostly input data. And on the other hand, the other perspective is that what are the requirements for algorithmic system? So this is more the AI debate. How do we have to shape AI systems and other algorithmic systems? So in order to make sure the outcome is an ethical one and one which we would like to see. So this is all the debate about human oversight and avoiding discrimination and all the rest of it. And there is, of course, that overlap. So you can't really draw a clear line between the two, because when you want to have AI, you need to train AI, you need data for that. So clearly AI is a data-driven technology. But then, at the end of the day, you will find that there are these two perspectives, and it's paradigmatic that also the European legislator and national legislators basically think of the two spheres as fairly distinct spheres. So we have data protection and similar legislation rather on the one side, and then AI legislation and legislation about algorithmic decision making, which may be on the horizon on the other side, even though the two are closely linked. And this is why we structured the two main parts of our report into precisely data on the one hand and algorithmic systems on the other. Now, obviously, I will not have the time to give you all the details of our recommendations, and I think it's also not important for me to do so because you can all read them online. They're all online, both in German and in English, even though the English translation may not always be very accurate, but it's there in both languages. So maybe just a few things about what we did on data. We developed 6 data governance principles, which are in line with the principles under Article 5 of the GDPR. So they will sound rather familiar to you when you know the principles under Article 5 of the GDPR, but they apply to personal as well as to non-personal data. So it's always very important for us to create guidelines and recommendations that apply to both personal and non-personal data. And so what we do, and what is maybe not so clearly found in Article 5 of the GDPR, is that we also stress the potential of data use and data sharing for the common good. And we recognize that there may, under certain circumstances, be an ethical imperative to use data. So it's not that we, take this position, which you sometimes find, that data sharing, data use is something really dangerous, which you have to minimize as far as possible. No, we see, we fully endorse the principles of the GDPR, but we believe they can be reconciled with the desire to make use of data, to make use of data-driven technologies for the public interest and for a better life for every one of us. So we kind of try to reconcile both. This is the general governance principles, but we also developed something which we call data rights and corresponding data obligations. It's about rights which a person, be it an individual, be it a company, has vis-a-vis a controller of data. And those rights may be about access, porting, desistance from use, rectification, or at receiving an economic share. Actually, the Data Ethics Commission hasn't developed this notion. This code-generated data approach was originally developed by the Principles for a Data Economy, which is a joint project by the American Law Institute and the European Law Institute. And so we also had some interim drafts of the ALI and ELI available for our work, and we adopted that approach and thought it was useful for our work. One of the main messages in this context is that we do not propose data ownership, at least not data ownership in terms of an exclusive ownership right as we have it with tangible property, as we have it with intellectual property. So we do not believe that this is the right way forward for a number of reasons, which I'm happy to explain in the discussion should there be a desire to discuss this. We think it wouldn't serve the interests of the individuals. We don't think it would serve the interests of the consumers. We don't think it would serve the interests of data holders, of the industry. So at the end of the day, we rather believe it's a bad idea, both from an ethical and from a pragmatic point of view. And we rather go for this code-generated data approach, which is much more flexible, which is based on the idea, if you like, of non-exclusive kind of ownership or ownership-like rights. much more flexible, and which is also reconcilable, by the way, with the GDPR, because the data subjects' rights under the GDPR are just a particularly important manifestation of those general data rights and corresponding obligations. And so it is possible to have one overarching ethical/legal framework for both personal and non-personal data. Yeah, just a few illustrations what it means, ethical imperative. You just imagine a hospital is experiencing an outbreak of some pathogen, or maybe COVID-19 would now be a better example. And then, you'd need to analyze the health data of some patients in order to benefit future patients' generations. So this would be an illustration which we used, and it would show a situation where we believe that could be an ethical imperative, in fact, to use data. This is maybe a very clear-cut example. There are more difficult ones, but it illustrates the general principle. We also, as I said, we believe that beyond personal data, also when it comes to non-personal data, there may be rights to required assistance from data use. So just imagine the situation where data collected by sensors and modern agricultural machinery, such as data collected by smart tractors, are used then by manufacturers as a basis for services they provide, but they might also potentially be forwarded to investors or lessors of land. And if that happened, then the latter would be given information that might prove harmful to the farmers. So this, for example, would be a case where we would say the farmer has a right to require desistance from data use, even though the data collected may be non-personal data. So that would give the farmer or farm corporation rights to require desistance from data use beyond the GDPR. That's also something that is based on that notion of co-generated data. And also rights to request access to data, for example, in the context of seeking the services of independent repair shops. There you need access to vehicle data, or you supply engines for the tractors. It would be very useful for the supplier of the engines to have certain tractor data. So that also would be a situation where, if you look at the guidelines we developed and that are based on the ALI-ELI principles, we would say there should be a right to access those data under certain conditions, possibly against remuneration, but there should be an access right. Okay, so this is in a nutshell what we did about general data rights. And now, given that time is running and we also want to have sufficient time for discussion, this is why I'm going to be a little bit brief maybe on what we said concerning specific contexts and all the specific recommendations we made. So I'm going to summarize a little bit what we did there, otherwise I would need hours. So what was very important to us was that we make recommendations for measures against what we took to be ethically indefensible uses of data, and against an existing enforcement gap, which we believe is just there. So mostly these measures are about really enforcing, really applying the law that is out there. We believe that there is a wide range of tools, including unfair contract terms control, the rules against unfair commercial practices, general private law, general administrative law that could be used against what we take to be ethically indefensible uses of data. And for a number of reasons, simply those rules are not being enforced, while they could at any day be enforced and used against all this. So this, for example, includes things such as dark patterns or addictive designs. So, you know, everybody is lamenting about dark patterns and addictive designs, and that the legislator should do something about it, while we believe there's a lot of law out there that would already allow us to do something against it. We have to enforce the law, we have to apply the law. And there is some context, however, where we see that we may need to amend the law, we may need some adjustments, and that concerns mainly profiling and trade in data. Now, we're quite pessimistic that anything will happen in the current revision of the GDPR, which would be the right place. So we don't cherish any illusions in that regard, but we definitely think it would be required. Then we make a lot of recommendations with regard to specific contexts, such as the notorious debate about data as counter-performance that was fueled by the Digital Content Directive. We also make a number of really concrete recommendations concerning personalized risk assessment. So, like, under what conditions is it acceptable to use personal data, such as data collected by a black box in a car, for calculating personalized insurance premiums? And we draft a list, we come forward with a list of requirements that need to be met in order for this being acceptable. We also deal with issues about digital inheritance, and we make a number of recommendations with regard to specific groups of data subjects. So we did a lot on employee data, and received a lot of support for that, by the way. We dealt with patients' rights, with minors, with vulnerable adults. So if you like, I'm happy to say more about this during the discussion if you're interested, but for the time being, I'd like to leave it with this summary. And also we make recommendations concerning the better implementation of privacy by design, including by getting a grip on producers. Because at the moment, this Article 25 GDPR is really nice, but it only addresses controllers. It doesn't address the producers of devices. It doesn't address the developers of digital services. So we believe, you know, these are the actors you need to get into the equation, and that is really important in order to implement privacy by design. We then have a chapter that's devoted to improving the controlled access to personal data. It's about creating better legal certainty for researchers. So we believe that the law is not very research friendly at the moment. We believe that it may need clarification, harmonization, be it at a national or at a European level. We believe that we could work on innovative forms of consent, and that we should definitely foster progress with anonymization techniques, with sophisticated, strong pseudonymization, and with research and other work on synthetic data. One point that is really, really important for us, and where we believe, you know, many problems we're seeing out there at the moment could be solved, is innovative data management and data trust schemes. So we believe that this could be a way to to reconcile the concerns of data protection and the concerns of data-driven research and the data economy. Because if you create trustworthy intermediaries, be they true intermediaries in terms of, you know, a company that is in between, or be it just technology that is used, that would this and should enact legislation that on the one hand makes it possible for such data trust schemes to really work and function well, but on the other hand to take safeguards against abuse, safeguards against conflicts of interest, and all the rest of it. So that is very important in our view. And then we also make some recommendations concerning interoperability and interconnectivity, part of which I have to say have already now been implemented after our opinion was out. And last but not least, in the data chapter, we address the whole debate about access to and sharing of non-personal data, which is now also one of the main targets of the European data strategy and also the national data strategy, of course. So what we do is we stress upfront what we call the ASISA principle, so awareness, skills, infrastructure, stocks, access, which means don't just look at the access side, please look also at the other levels. It's not just about creating ever more access to data. It's not even clear whether this is the main problem, but please also create data awareness among businesses. Many businesses have really valuable data but have no clue what they could do with it. Please invest into skills. If you have the most valuable data but don't have the skills to use them, that's maybe not helpful then. Invest in infrastructures, which is being done. We see all these European data spaces and national data spaces being set up. So I think that's really, really important. And then, only look at access later. We believe that in some places it may be helpful to adapt the current legislative framework. So we believe that we may need limited third-party effects of data contracts. We believe there may be, we may need some facilitations for data pooling. And we believe there may be some need to better enforce rights in co-generated data. These suggestions are again inspired by the work of the American Law Institute and the European Law Institute. We also make a number of recommendations concerning open data in the public sector, which we believe is very important, but where we believe, some things might need to be changed in order to fully unleash the potential. And when it comes to open data in the private sector, we believe that we should primarily focus on voluntary data sharing and otherwise have a rather cautious approach to statutory duties. I don't know, Roberto, should I pause at this point and answer some questions first, or should I continue?
Christiane, there are so many questions that I think the best would be that you continue with the algorithmic part, and then I go backwards with all there's plenty of questions. So
okay,
really interesting.
I don't see them on my screen. This is my problem because
but I see them on the chat.
One small screen, and as I said, you need to give me an acoustic signal because I can't see them.
I would suggest you continue with the second part, and then we reserve all the time for questions.
Great, wonderful. So I will then continue with the second big part, and I will not take as much time as I did for the rest. Algorithmic systems. So we as I already indicated, we do not deal with AI as such. We deal with algorithmic systems because we believe AI is just a subset of algorithmic systems. So we don't deal with AI as such. We differentiate different ways in which algorithmic systems can be used. So there may be decisions that are algorithm based, but whether the basic decision is still taken by humans. We see algorithm-driven decisions where the algorithm offers just a few options between which the human then chooses, and we see algorithm-determined decisions. So yeah, so this is a differentiation we make, and then the most famous claim we make is probably this idea of a risk-based regulatory framework. So probably you've seen this pyramid, which we call the criticality pyramid. Its main message is, or one of the main messages is that, you know, there is a huge green part at the bottom, and probably this green part would have to be much bigger still, and the yellow and orange parts would need to be smaller, but then you wouldn't have been able to read the text. So one of the main messages is that we believe for the vast majority of algorithmic systems, you don't need any regulation whatsoever. And but then for critical algorithmic systems with an enhanced potential for harm, you need a graded, risk-based system of regulation. And then there may be some where you have an untenable potential for harm. So, and the measures that we consider adequate for control of algorithmic systems should be proportionate, strictly proportionate to the risk created. So it's not so important to us whether it's now 3 shades of orange or 2 shades of orange or whatever. That's not the main message. But we believe this risk-based, this strictly proportionate approach is essential. So, for example, I will maybe skip this for time reasons so that we have more time for the discussion. Just to give an illustration, you know, the vast majority of algorithmic systems, like the algorithm used in vending machines and in you know, most of algorithmic systems we know around us will not require any kind of specific measures beyond what we have anyway in terms of contract law and tort law and whatever. But then there may be some algorithmic systems that are a little bit more difficult. Level 2, for example, we see dynamic pricing. So it's not personalized pricing, it's dynamic pricing, but still there could be some cover discrimination. And so it may be good to look at this a little bit more closely. Things get a little bit more risky when we enter the sphere of personalized prices, where prices are fixed individually, because there is now really an appreciable potential for harm concerning discrimination, concerning exploitation of vulnerable groups. It doesn't take much to imagine how this could be used to really, you know, get the money out of particularly vulnerable individuals. And there we would see, you know, for example, a licensing procedure to be absolutely appropriate. And then there may be, you know, the really critical systems where you have players with huge market power, which may be used to determine the creditworthiness of people, and where, you know, it's really about deciding about a person's fate, and there is no way to escape, because there is market concentration with very few providers of that technology. So if for whatever reason the algorithm used by those actors, you know, goes bogus and or discriminates or whatever, then this has really a huge impact on society, a huge impact on human rights, on individuals. So this is where we believe, you know, a lot of scrutiny is required in order to safeguard fundamental rights. And then in some cases, you know, in particular in the context of lethal autonomous weapons, even a borderline may be crossed where we say, no, this is no longer defensible on any conditions. What we then propose in terms of action is a horizontal regulation at EU level and sector-specific legislation at both EU and national levels. So we propose that the EU come up with something like an algorithmic systems regulation, and then there is sector-specific regulation below that at both levels. What should be in those instruments? I want to be brief. There is a portfolio of labeling requirements, information duties, duties to explain. It's about risk assessment, quality control, different levels of human oversight, individual protection, in, you know, even beyond what Article 22 of the GDPR already provides. It's about rethinking anti-discrimination law. So there is a wide portfolio of things that should be addressed, but it shouldn't all be addressed by the legislator. So it's also about, you know, co-regulation and self-regulation. There should be a national center of competence at federal level to make sure all this happens, or to coordinate the work done basically by the sectoral authorities and make sure everything runs smoothly and every authority has the support, in particular the technical support they need. We are proposing algorithmic accountability codex, quality seals, contact persons in companies, in government authorities. But again, to stress that this is not all about hard and fast regulation. Much of this can be dealt with at, you know, with co-regulation, with self-regulation. There may be lots of softer instruments to implement all this. We also make specific recommendations concerning algorithmic systems used by some really important and powerful media intermediaries whom we consider to be gatekeepers to democracy, and where we not only call for labeling duties, but also we call for an obligation to offer an alternative channel with a balanced and unbiased portfolio, for example, of news items. So as a measure against those filter bubbles and echo chambers, and against what we see is happening with social bots. We also make specific recommendations when it comes to use of algorithmic systems by state bodies, where we see an enhanced level of criticality and the need for particularly strict requirements, dependent inter alia on whether this is about lawmaking or judiciary or administration. And at the end of the day, it all needs to be backed up by a good liability system. We believe our whole liability system needs a digital fitness check. And so it was beyond the mandate of this commission to fix the details, but we were pretty clear, and it was a pretty unanimous vote that we said, first, you need to adapt the liability system, but please don't touch electronic personhood. We believe electronic personhood is not necessary. We believe it's not the right way. So just to explain, electronic personhood is the idea that a robot or an AI itself becomes liable. That would require, of course, that the robot or other AI is equipped with funds, and this is a suggestion that has been made, in particular by the European Parliament. We believe it's not the right way to deal with things, and we are very glad to see that I think even the European Parliament has meanwhile taken a different approach. So to close with, and I see my 1 hour, which Roberto asked me to speak, is exactly over. So it's exactly 3 o'clock. To close with, I would like to stress what we say about a European path. So the Data Ethics Commission is very supportive of the European path that has been taken, which is often described as a kind of third path between the paths taken on the one hand by the US and on the other hand by legal systems as we find it in China. So it's a path of consistent alignment of technology with European values and fundamental rights. We believe it's absolutely essential to remain on that path and not try to imitate basically what's happening in some other regions of the world. We believe it's important we stick to European values, and we believe we can turn it into a competitive advantage. But we see it as absolutely vital to ensure Europe's digital sovereignty. And we see this digital sovereignty, which means that we don't want to see a situation where Europe is absolutely dependent on players in other parts of the world and is no longer able to guarantee its European values and fundamental rights to its citizens. So we want to avoid that level of dependence, and we believe that avoiding such kind of dependency and ensuring a sufficient degree of digital sovereignty is part of our European leaders' ethical responsibility. And with this emphatic plea for a European path, I would like to close my brief presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions that might arise. So thank you very much for your attention. And I need now Roberto to tell me exactly what I should do, whether I should stop sharing the screen or not, or switch on.
First of all, thank you. Keep the screen on because it's nice to see the screen. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. The audience has been very active. So there are so many questions that is really a challenge for me to pick all the questions that are relevant. I start with one that I want to ask you myself, and the rest I'll read it from the chat. When you go back to your general ethical principle, one of those is democracy. I was very pleased to see that. Did the Ethics Commission look, especially when they look at the algorithmic part, so the AI more related part. What happens if some AI is developed or deployed into an area, what you call ecosystem or boundary, that is not necessarily democratic?
Thank you very much. So you mean where AI is developed in a region of the world that does not follow democratic principles? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Well, I mean, the fact itself that this, I think this is an extremely important question you're asking, and I think it has a number of different facets. So you could understand it as saying, you know, is it safe to trust an AI that was developed in such a region? You could also understand it as saying, should we, by buying this AI, support that region that is not, you know, or that is built on different notions of fundamental rights as ours? And should we, by, you know, engaging with these systems, maybe enhance still the dependency that may already be there? In terms of what I said about digital sovereignty. So I think there are different facets to this question, and it really depends on, you know, which perspective you take. I think, in particular, I think the perspective that has been debated most is the perspective: should you be allowed to buy a product, to buy AI, despite the fact that you know it's being developed without regard to, let's say, fundamental principles of data protection, human dignity, and so on. And there I would clearly see there are limits. I mean, no doubt we can't expect the rest of the world to have exactly, you know, the same level of protection as the GDPR provides. So we can't say we're not going to buy that Chinese AI because China hasn't enacted the GDPR. So that would be clearly not a little bit overdoing things. But definitely, I think there are limits. And we don't see this only with regard to AI. We see this in other, you know, this is all this debate about human rights violations in other parts of the world in very traditional supply chains. I think there are clearly limits where you see, you know, AI was produced by very techniques which we consider to be very unethical, and then we cannot buy that kind of AI. And we see the same phenomenon in other supply chains. We see where, like, textiles were produced under conditions that are not reconcilable with our notions of human rights. So we should really get a grip on this. And so I think your question has many different facets, but that would be my reply to one of them.
Thank you. Well, it was also a difficult question for sure. I'm going backwards to the chat, and bear with me, I won't be able to ask all the questions because there are many, but let me start from the beginning, from Yvonne. She's a lawyer by training, so you get a background. She's asking, what is the progress on implementing these guidelines since you released them in 2019? Are they used to transition AI ethics into soft law? Are they used as a source for law, or they just disappear in somebody's drawer?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the process is not yet over. You know, I mean, we submitted the opinion in late 2019. Then we still had presentations before a number of political bodies in as late as January, and then the Corona crisis started at some point. So as far as we can see, there are a number of developments that do take our work into account. And I mean, these are, for example, the data strategy both at national level and the data strategy at European level, where when you read the data strategy closely, you see direct or indirect references to our work. For example, our suggestions on data trustees, for example, what we said about co-generated data. And equally, when you read the Commission white paper on AI, you will realize that the Commission read our opinion very closely, and they also explicitly refer to our model, which we submitted. So I think our opinion has been read very carefully and is being used and cited and considered in those files, yeah, the data strategy and the general future legislation on AI, which we may see very soon. There are a number, but you know, given when you make 75 recommendations, you can never expect that all of them will be addressed. You know, you can be quite happy if a fair number of them is going to be addressed. As far as many of the more technical stuff is concerned, like suggestions when it comes to unfair contract terms control, when it comes to tort law, when it comes to, you know, the more in digital inheritance, more the details, we know discussions are ongoing. We've been at several points asked to present our findings, to maybe also explain how they could be translated into legislation. So I think a good number of recommendations will be taken up in one form or the other, but it would equally be an illusion to believe that there is now a commission sitting at federal government level and ticking off the boxes and not finishing their work before they fully implemented our opinion. So that would certainly also be an exaggerated expectation.
Yeah, thank you. That was a good answer. There's another question from Fabio Pistella, who, by the way, used to be the head of the Research Council in Italy, is asking, has the document been the object of public discussion, request or comments, or proposal of integration?
Yes, so that's also a very good question. So we of course, while drafting the document, we made efforts to engage with the public at several stages. So there were several public conferences where we also tried to, you know, get as many different parts of civil society involved, as many stakeholders as possible involved. So we did involve stakeholders and the general public while the document was being drafted. I would have loved, and this is what I said at the beginning, I would have loved to see a scheme where we, for example, put this 240 pages document online, then get feedback from the public, and then get the opportunity to sit down again and revise it, and maybe boil it down to half the number of pages. But in any case, to take public debate into account. Unfortunately, we were being told we need the final results in November 2019. So this public debate and then revise, which was something the high-level expert group on AI at EU level did, was not the idea of the federal government. So I would have loved to do it, but we were not given that mandate. So what we received was, of course, a number of reactions in the media from the general public. Most of them supportive, I have to say, and I'm still getting lots of feedback, for example, from people who use this as course materials with their students and so on. So I'm getting a lot of useful and helpful and overall very positive feedback. Of course, there was also criticism. So the criticism that it's too regulatory, not enough ethics in there. So these were, I think, the two main points of criticism. Yeah, I mean that's the nature of debate.
Thank you. Let me move forward. There's a question from my colleague Florian Möslein, is a professor of law, so you can talk among colleagues. He's basically asking, to what extent do ethical principles help? For instance, how can they be enforced? Why at all rely on ethics rather than on law? After all, most of these principles are already embedded in the legal order. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, Florian, I think that's a very good question. I don't know whether you were already on the call when I tried to explain our attitude towards the relationship between law and ethics. I mean, for us, really the two are not strictly separate. Ethics and law are distinct, but law has to comply with ethical requirements, or should comply with ethical requirements. And as you rightly say, Florian, it already does to a large extent. And then we believe that it's part of an ethical approach to make the very important, the most fundamental ethical requirements mandatory so that people can enforce their rights. So I think we're pretty much on the same track there. Now the question is why have another? Is your question more why have another ethics commission that has ethics in the title and not law, or is your question more about how to then translate those ethical principles into law? The latter, I have to say, is one of the most difficult questions we're now facing, and I spent the whole morning in a call debating, in detail how all these wonderful ethical principles, which we find in particular for AI, could be translated then into hard and fast legislation. And I think it will not always be possible. We may at the end of the day come up with a mixture that works with, and you see that picture, a similar mixture, for example, when you look at the GDPR, you have those, if you like, ethical principles in Article 5, but which are not only ethical, they also serve as the underlying motives, as they serve to kind of guide the interpretation of the GDPR. They serve to guide the interpretation of contracts and so on. So when you look at how the General Data Protection Board, for example, is now using Article 5 in specific contexts, you realize that these principles, even they may look very soft at first, they are really quite forceful, and they can have legal impact. So yeah, I think we're pretty much on the same track when we say, you know, it's law that matters in the end. But still, I think it's very useful to develop ethical principles first in order to have better guidance in what direction the law should develop. And then it may be useful here and there to also enshrine those principles in the law.
Yeah, thank you. More questions. So you let me know when your capacity or answering question is at the end. I have a long list, so I'll go through. There's a question from Andy Bushell in Switzerland. He said, how do you think your recommendation should cope with the following 4 dilemmas? Individual versus group, short versus long term, truth versus loyalty, justice versus mercy. I read it exactly as it is.
Okay, so yeah, so up front I have to put a disclaimer. We had 1 year for a very, very broad field, and like over 50 very concrete questions to address. So I have to apologize in advance that you may not find exhaustive answers to all those dilemmas you have rightly mentioned in our opinion. So yes, maybe let me pick out 1 or 2 of the dilemmas which you mentioned, and let me pick right the first one, which is individual versus group. We did, in fact, see that dilemma, in particular when it came to the data part, because as we all know, the General Data Protection Regulation and other data law out there very much relies on the notion of a bilateral relationship between A data subject, and B, a controller. But we all know equally that this is oversimplifying things, and that things are not as simple as that in the real world, but that anything I do with my data has implications for third parties. So whether I am allowed to delete my chat, or to, you know, whether I opt into an insurance scheme, it always has implications for third parties. So we saw that. We had, I have to say, an intensive discussion of whether we should, you know, be very daring and ambitious and try to design the new relational data law scheme. And at the end of the day, we left it, also because we had only 1 year, also because we were laboring under all sorts of other, you know, restrictions in terms of what our topping and our mandate was. We left it with referring to that tension at several places in our opinion. For example, we have a section on collective data rights. So basically, what we did is we took the co-generated data approach developed by the ALI and ELI and kind of transferred that to a more collective dimension, and mentioned the possibility and some conditions under which there may be collective data rights. So this is one place in our opinion where we deal with that dilemma. And then of course we deal with this dilemma every time there is something about a clash with interests of third parties, you know, where it's about donating your health data for the improvement of health-focused research and so on. So, but if you ask me whether we've come up with a grand theory to address all these 4 dilemmas which you mentioned, you rightly mentioned, I have to say, well, at some point we have to stop.
Thank you. Let me move forward. There's a question from Fabio Pistella. It might be technical, but I think it's quite relevant. Is asking, is it unanimously accepted that artificial intelligence can always be considered as an algorithmic system?
Well, I think it depends on the definitions. At the end of the day, I don't know. Maybe it would be good if Fabio could explain his question. So, is your question more from a technical perspective that you believe it may be technically inaccurate to do so, or is it more from a philosophical point of view that you believe?
I think it's technical. I can read the rest of the question. Actually, the example is, consider a learning system. The answer to the question and data consequently created finally depend on the history of the system experience. Can this consider an algorithm system? Probably the question can be asked because in your group, what kind of evidence was raised to make the assumption that AI is always like a normal algorithm? Was a discussion? Was some kind of
no
group?
Okay, no, then I have to apologize. Then maybe I was my language was misleading. Nobody in the group said, that those very sophisticated systems that use, for example, neural networks and so on, that they are like the calculating machine we used at school in past decades. So nobody would ever make that assumption. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been necessary to have a data ethics commission. So no, it was absolutely clear to us that things have entered a new dimension, and that there are features to what we often call AI that makes a new critical, ethical, and legal assessment necessary. However, we also saw that many of the legal and ethical implications, for example, the situation of the individual that is faced with a fully automated decision, like on their creditworthiness, and that has no idea how this decision came about, that has maybe no way to challenge this, at least everything addressed, of course, by Article 22 GDPR, but that has no idea how this decision can be explained, how to challenge the decision, whether the decision was discriminatory or not. The problems faced by such an individual do depend only to a certain gradual extent on whether that was a rule-based system or a system that at some point used self-learning. And also, there is that that floating scale, if you like, like some systems learn still in the field when they are in use. Some were only trained in the development phase, and then the algorithm was frozen at some point. So it was, on the one hand, all these shades of gray between rule-based and fully AI, and on the other hand, it was that we saw the legal and ethical implications may sometimes not differ so much, and it may be misleading to believe that everything that is achieved by way of traditional rule-based systems is okay, and everything that uses any kind of machine learning is terribly dangerous. That this black and white may not be appropriate.
Thank you. We have a question from Andy Bushell again, is interested in your opinion on how any set of ethics recommendation like the one you've done relies on the national culture and associative value set in which it would be implemented. must we inevitably have national guidance, or shall we, or are we able to have commonalities across cultures?
Well, I think that's also a very difficult question. I mean, when you mean that, why did we have a German data ethics commission and not, you know, a European data ethics commission? I think we did have a European Data Ethics Commission too, indeed. So I think the reason why something was put up at national level was also that the German federal government in particular wanted to have guidance on a number of questions which they in fact had, and which partly concerned specifically German law, or which concerned a future position to be taken in discussions at European level. So I think it made absolutely sense to establish a German committee and tasking it with some with a specific mandate. That having said, I'm not sure that the results we achieved would have looked so differently if it had been an Italian committee or whatever. So I think we pretty much took a European perspective on the matter. And I think, but this may be overtly optimistic, that you know, in particular in Europe, we jointly build on a common basis, which is made up of really shared notions of basic values and fundamental rights and so on. So maybe I'm too optimistic, but I think at least in Europe, we think by and large sufficiently similarly on a number of very fundamental issues, and that this justifies, you know, also taking action at European level. I realize things may be, the attitude towards technology, the attitude towards individual rights may be entirely different in other parts of the world. But as I said, that shouldn't stop us for doing what we believe is the right thing for Europe.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question from my colleague Ken Bierman, who's a professor at Cornell in the States, so I think it fits quite well this discussion. He's actually had two questions for you. Is curious to know your opinion about any COVID apps, tracing, tracking, and your opinion about self-driving cars. It could be your personal opinion, it could be the opinion of through the lenses of the Commission, whatever you prefer.
Well, given that the Commission didn't have an opportunity to discuss COVID-19 apps, it's difficult to say what the Commission's position would be. But as it happens, I just chaired a committee for our national, not the German, but the Austrian National Bioethics Committee, and we just drafted an opinion on that. So to start with, there is not one COVID app. We see a wide range of different applications that are called COVID apps. So it all depends. Are you talking about those track and trace apps? Are you talking about symptom check apps, about information apps, about, you know, quarantine apps? So there is a broad range of different apps. But if you talk about track and trace apps, I think, again, there are so many different architectures which we see in the field. If you take what seems to be now the predominant approach in Europe, with some exceptions, which is that fully decentralized approach, where you have data stored only in the relevant private devices, and where basically hardly any data is processed in a central structure. And I think that honestly, any impacts for data protection are so minimal that I see many of the concerns that are being voiced in the media and so on as totally unfounded. And I think that with this absolutely decentralized a system that is really an optimal example of what privacy by design may mean in practice, I really think that this is a very good thing. Whether or not it makes sense from an epidemiological point of view is a different question. And also, I think, but this now takes us very far away from the original topic of the lecture. It's a number of requirements need to be met in order for this to make sense. So it's not just sufficient to have an app and download the app. It all needs to be part of a big system of testing facilities, of proper responses at various levels. But if all this is okay, I think those track and trace apps based on the decentralized architecture can be an extremely useful tool, provided they are used in a way that makes sense from an epidemiological point of view. And that I'm the wrong person to answer. We see very discouraging data from Australia, for example, and from Singapore. And so far we have little data that shows to what extent this really helps contain the pandemic. But that is then maybe not within the realm of the topic of my lecture. That's for epidemiologists and maybe mathematicians to judge. So from an ethical point of view, I would say any kind of not even infringement, not any kind of problems with individual rights are so minimal in this architecture that I would believe encouragement of the use of those decentralized apps is absolutely ethically defensible. And but I'm I know I'm on dangerous ground here. I would even believe that given that in this decentralized architecture, there is basically no privacy concern anymore, I would even consider it possible to make the use of such apps mandatory for certain facilities like concerts or theaters and so on. Because they might in fact be the lesser remedy when you compare it with much more intrusive methods that would be the alternative. Yeah, so this is maybe all. I could talk for an hour about COVID apps now, but I realize I'm getting a little bit off track from the topic of my lecture.
Well, thank you for taking the courage also to give a personal opinion, because I think it's very important. There's a question for Gerald Santucci, who, by the way, used to work for the European Commission. And he's asking, how do you define co-regulation? He has two alternatives. I don't know if you agree with these two alternatives. He said, one, a specific interpretation of an existing general law. Two, ethics recommendations that are defined by all in capital stakeholders, enforceable under some supervision, federal, European Union, etc. You have any opinion on that?
Sorry, I'm not sure, given that I couldn't see the spelling in front of me, I'm not sure I fully understood the two the two options you were giving.
I can reread it slowly. So he's asking,
Yeah.
maybe we start with, what is your definition of co-regulation?
Yeah, so I mean in the opinion, we don't, you know, go into these issues in very much detail. But you know, there's under the new regulatory framework and so on, there are different techniques where you kind of don't just in you know, have all the rules in the top level regulation, but there's a really, it's very rather complicated. There's a whole range of different mechanisms of either referring in the top level legislation to standards to be developed then by industry, or you know, to establish by way of top level legislation certain institutions that then have certain authorities and certain competences, by establishing by top level legislation certain certification requirements with the details then to be fixed by other actors, including in particular the industry. So I was more in my lecture now taking this as a generic term for all the many different how should I put it, governance schemes we see and that rely on a kind of cooperation between the state or the European Union and the industry that is being regulated, where, you know, not all the details are fixed by the state or by the European Union, but where you regulated industry and the regulator.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of last questions, if you still are willing to answer two questions.
Sure.
There's one that is from me. When you talk about this risk pyramid that is quite well known, one concern, talking to a few people, this is a static classification. So somebody has to make a decision which domain of application with AI or algorithmic fits into green or into yellow. This is the first question. So who's making this decision? And second, most importantly, what happened of the changes over time? You mentioned that some AI system evolve over time. What happened if they start green and become red?
No, absolutely. Thank you very much for those questions. I mean, we address this problem, and we basically say that this risk assessment needs to be repeated basically at regular intervals, be it routinely, be it when something relevant happens and the risk level may change. So it's not meant to be static. And of course, you know, every visualization has its benefits and has its downsides. I realize the risk pyramid or criticality pyramid also has its downsides because, as you say, it may kind of imply this sort of static approach, which was not at all what we intended. And we tried to explain that in our comments, but I realize, of course, that it was difficult to convey that message also in the in the chart itself. And it's not just the development over time, it's also the context. I think we have that in our opinion at some point, that it's so difficult to say, take, for example, an algorithm that chooses news items to be displayed on a user's smartphone. So depending on the context in which this is used, this may range from totally harmless, like I don't know, when I browse the today's cinema program, and there is a personalized algorithm which believes that I may be more interested in children's movie, being a mother of 4, than in, I don't know, some horror videos. This may be totally harmless, but then the very same algorithm, in fact, it may be the same code used in what we call a gatekeeper for democracy situation, where maybe a whole generation of people derives their political thoughts and their education in some parts from certain social media, where this very same algorithm is highly critical. And so we really have to look at the individual context and at the individual situation, and we have to take into account development over time.
Thank you. That was very useful answer. I would say we conclude with the last question from Karsten Wendland, and he's asking, one, at what stage of development should AI machines no longer be treated like devices, but rather out of ethical consideration like minimal conscious existence? How would you make the difference? And then he's asking, is this a serious topic for an ethical committee?
Well, as I tried to say, in our view, we thought it was our mandate to deal with the kind of AI we're currently seeing out there, and which we're likely to see over the next decade or 2 decades or so. Now, I'm not an AI specialist, but all the experts we asked said and told us that if at all this question should ever arise, as a question, not saying it should be answered that way, but should it at all arise, it's going to be like, in 50 years or so. I don't know whether that is correct. It may be totally wrong. It may be in 20 years already, or in 30 years, or whatever. But anyway, we dealt with that kind of artificial intelligence which we are likely to see in the next future, and which does not even come close to anything of the like as we see in science fiction movies, where AI has has feelings and self-consciousness and so on. And we do not, also to clarify this, we do not consider a self-optimizing algorithm to be automatically self-consciousness. So that we would that notion we would reject. So we would reject any notion that says, the kind of positive feedback given by a self-optimizing algorithm when something is achieved, we would not put that anywhere close any kind of human emotion. And And so this bigger question, which may or may not arise at some point in the future, we didn't deal with, honestly. Because for the time being, we don't see that the technology has anything that would even, justify the question of, kind of minimum rights or whatever, and personality and personhood on the part of the technology. We deal with it in the mainly in the liability context, where we have seen that proposal by the European Parliament in 2017, and I think the majority, meanwhile, of colleagues reject the idea to give anything like personhood to those systems. At least not personhood, anywhere in the direction of the personhood of natural persons. What we may discuss, but that is an entirely different discussion, is whether it makes sense for in some contexts, to create new legal entities, to have something like an E-limited or so. I don't know whether it makes sense. I don't see at the moment why we need it, but this may be something debatable already now, but I honestly don't see at the moment that we should have this debate. Anyway, we didn't deal with that topic.
Thank you. Thank you, Christiane, for a very interesting lecture and 50 minutes of question and answer. So that was remarkable. And as you've seen from the number of questions, your presentation raised a lot of interest, and we hope that this could be the beginning of a journey. So thank you very much for accepting to give a lecture here.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It was really good discussing, and yeah, it's I like a few months ago, I wouldn't have thought that discussing via Zoom and similar tools becomes our normal way of life, but we've all become used to it, and I've truly enjoyed it. So thank you very much for the invitation.
And thank you very much for being with us, although via Zoom. And also thank you for all the attendees that ask a lot of interesting questions. So I wish all of you a very good day and a safe continuation. So enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.